Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the PEN Salon. I was going to say saloon, but it's not quite that time of day yet. But I'm Boyd Tonkin. I'm senior writer at The Independent, and it's my huge pleasure to welcome Jim Crace as one of our guests today. I used to think that taking really fantastic writers to a book fair was a bit like taking sheep to Smithfield Market. However, they do get out in one piece, and I'm really delighted that Jim could join us today. He is, I think, one of the most outstanding writers at work in Britain over recent decades. He has a shelf of 11 utterly distinctive novels. Each one is unique. Each one creates a world of its own, and yet they all very obviously come from the same very special imagination. Just before we talk a few words of introduction, Jim was born in Hertfordshire. He was a journalist before becoming a full-time writer, and he began his career in fiction with Continent in the 1980s. That has been followed by many, many remarkable novels. I won't go through the entire canon. I'll just pick out a few. The Gift of Stones, Arcadia, Quarantine, Being Dead, Six, and more recently, All That Follows, The Pest House, and his most recent novel, which is called Harvest, which was published last year, was Booker shortlisted, and has fairly recently come out in a paperback. And Jim has kindly agreed to do signings of his books at Foyles just behind us after the event. But I wanted to kick off by asking Jim about, in a way, the function of an organization like PEN and the relationship between the solitary life of the individual writer, crafting these imaginary worlds almost out of nothing, and the sense, if you like, of the Republic of Letters, made up of people doing similar things, but often in circumstances that are far from congenial and can often be downright dangerous. Is this something that you've always been aware of?
Well, Boyd, I'm aware that I've led a really risk-free, lucky life as a writer. And it's risk-free in all sorts of ways. One, because of the good fortune I have to have been born in this country at this time, into a family that wasn't destroyed by poverty or illness or anything of that kind. And also to be the kind of writer I am. And I stand before you, I have to admit, as a male, middle-aged, middle-class, heterosexual. And really we're the most, the least leaned upon and the least legislated against and the least bullied section of British society. And so that's made me very aware of my good fortune, my geographical good fortune, and the fact that I can hardly complain about the way in which society treats me. And actually, this explains a lot about the kind of fiction I do. The fiction I write is not autobiographical because of this very profile I've just explained to you. You mentioned to me earlier is it Monthalin quote that...
happiness writes white.
Happiness writes white. I couldn't write an autobiographical novel because there aren't any of the things in it that literature seems to embrace so thoroughly. Literature prefers war to peace. It prefers ill health to good health. It prefers divorce to longevity. to long marriages. All of those things, literature likes the dark corners of the universe rather than the well-lit parts of the universe. And so even my good fortune has handed me a gift in that I can't write autobiographical novels. But I was just thinking about this on the train coming down today, and there's a very odd relationship between the kind of outrage that brings writers in other countries into conflict with their governments and puts them into prison and sometimes gets them killed by the state. And that is that because writers like the dark side of life so much and need it so much, you have the strange situation where you would say, if it wasn't for war, there would have been no Tolstoy's War and Peace. The novel Peace does not sell. If it wasn't for sexism, those great feminist novels of the 1970s wouldn't exist. If it wasn't for homophobia, the great ongoing swathe of gay novels that have been published over the last 20 or 30 years here and abroad wouldn't exist. If it wasn't for colonialism, we wouldn't have had that towering book, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, for which he won pretty much the Nobel Prize. So it's a very conflicted thing, that the very things that we hate and the very things that actually Amnesty and PEN are campaigning against are the very things that writers feed upon. So for me, it's really important that I am reminded constantly of that circumstance. I'm reminded of my own good fortune, and I'm reminded also of the way in which we are parasitic as writers on the way that the world functions darkly. And PEN has been brilliant at reminding us of those things and brilliant at drawing out our consciences in ways which are not just self-serving. I was thinking in a way that it's not dissimilar from the situation that the editor of Private Eye, whose name I can never remember,
Ian Hislop.
Ian Hislop must have. Could you see Ian Hislop on television on that Have I Got Good News for You, always looking outraged and horrified at the wickedness of the world and the corruption of the world. But actually, you know that Private Eye does not exist without those things. And he must know that as well. We know that he's looking very grim-faced and disapproving when he hears about the latest MP who's been backhanding themselves. But actually, in the privacy of his office, he's clapping his hands with glee because there's something that will provide words. So there are lots of examples of this level of hypocrisy, and I'm pleading guilty to my part in it.
Okay, well, it's a very interesting question raised there about the kind of fiction that you do so magnificently, because you've always had this great sense of public commitment, of responsibility. You've been an activist, you've been a volunteer, you've been a journalist, you've been engaged with the external world in the most direct ways. And yes, of course, your own fiction is not naturalistic or repertorial in any obvious ways. And I'm very, very interested in the process by which all of that engagement with the external world is somehow filtered into the completely different kinds of imaginative universe that we find in your novels. Do you know yourself how it happens?
The basis of this is a mixture of there's Puritanism. I mean, I'm libertarian. Half of me is libertarian, and the other half is very puritanical. And the Puritanism for me starts. I come from a North London working class background, which was political and atheistic and big-hearted, but very dogmatic. And when I was a kid, the books that I looked at were the kind of books that continued the political debate, that you felt could change hearts and minds. And, you know, there are great examples of that. Steinbeck, for example, Jack London, political writers George Orwell. I mean, my particular favorite, coming from the sort of background I had, was The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists, which was this story of trade unionism and house decorators in Hastings at the turn of the century. The great thing about this is it sets whole new agendas, that novel, in the minds of socialists, but it's not a very good book. And I was very aware that the important thing was to be sincere and to have an agenda and to try and take part in debates, and that the importance of finely turned literature was only secondary. But look what's happened. I tried to write those novels that would change people's opinions. I tried to become a political novelist. I tried to write the kind of novel that was a placard, that was a leaflet, and found that they were dead on the page, that I didn't have that skill. I mean, basically, I was a soprano trying to sing contralto. There was no depth to my writing when I was writing like that. So I was forced into addressing my politics in a more diffuse, a more bourgeois way, I would say. So my 17-year-old self wanted to write leaflet novels, campaigning novels. But when I started being successful as a writer, I was writing exactly the kind of novel that my 17-year-old self would sneer at. So that's getting round to the answer. So when I came to write these novels, which are very moralistic, they're very traditional in style, they're very rhythmic. They're so rhythmic in the way they're written that Adam Mars Jones said that to read a single paragraph of one Jim Crace novel is to invite a migraine. So don't worry, migraine sufferers, I won't be reading anything today. So what I've tried to do very puritanically in these books is to make sure that they don't just become servants of fine prose, and that whatever I do, even if I have to force an issue onto my books, I try to make sure that they have some much wider political relevance than initially they might have when they occur to me.
Thank you. And this leads on neatly to the next subject I wanted to discuss. As is obvious, you're a man of the left, you're a man who wants to make the world better. You're a man who has a great faith in humanity. And yet, if you look at your fiction, and particularly if I simply mention the last three books, Harvest, All That Follows, The Pest House, there is this recurrent dystopian strain of scenes of nightmare, scenes of threat, scenes in which humanity and human values are very much being tested, and in the case of the Pest House, tested to destruction and beyond. So I wanted to ask, is there any sort of tension between, as it were, Jim Crace the optimist and Jim Crace the imaginative pessimist, or do they rub along fairly well?
What you've just described is evidence of my optimism, not evidence of my pessimism. Because if you think about it, if you say the person that has an untroubled life, for them to be optimistic, that is no triumph at all. For somebody who lives constantly under a rainbow, optimism is the default position. And it's kind of worthless for that reason. It's not hard. It's a soft thing. But for somebody to go to all the dark places in that life offers, to look at death, for example, to look at war, to look at illness, to look at the breakup of relationships, to look at the bullying by capitalist classes, and still feel optimistic and full of hope, that is a real triumph. So my optimism of my novels, and I'm always baffled by this, when people say I'm a pessimist and a dark writer. What I want to do in my novels is to take you really to the abyss, to show you the dark things about the world that we all know exists, and yet, despite the darkness, to come up with a narrative of comfort and optimism. I'm often disappointed. I find that a lot of readers don't find that optimism there. But when I dig, it's because the reader is not the optimist, rather than me. I mean, recently I had not so recently, a couple of years ago, a critic said that I take a boyish delight in disgust. And I was very shocked by this and actually upset by this description. And the writer, the woman who wrote the criticism, was talking about my descriptions of natural history. And then I realized that actually I feel no disgust about natural history. Natural history is my subject, I should say. And what the woman who was making the criticism was saying was that, to repeat the rainbow idea, is that if natural history comprises of nightingales and daffodils and rainbows, then she's happy with it. But natural history does not comprise of only of those things. Natural history, if you walk around the countryside of any place in the world, what you're walking on is mostly dead matter. And the world mostly comprises of the ending of life rather than the beginning of life. And actually, if you're interested in natural history, you're much better, if you're interested in flies, for example, do as I often do when I walk across a field, look in a cowpat, and you'll find up to a dozen different kinds of fly in that cowpat. And so this is the richness of natural history to be found in dark places. If you want to, you can see that as evidence of pessimism. But my view is that to be optimistic about the world, you have to embrace it all, otherwise your optimism is worthless and thin.
Thank you, and that gives me a neat cue for something else I was very keen to ask, which is, as well as being, as you say, in some sense a political writer, you're also a kind of Darwinian writer, that there is this enormously powerful sense of these vast natural processes working themselves out over vast spans of space and time. And if you look, for instance, at Being Dead, where we certainly have probably the most charismatic corpses in contemporary British fiction. And of course, as you will well know, there was a time when this kind of Darwinian vision was very much captured by the right. Social Darwinism, what was a deeply reactionary ideology in the late 19th centuries, which had to do with the survival of the fittest, with the elimination of allegedly inferior peoples and species. And yet, as you say, for you, that Darwinian vision is a vision of blossoming and diversity and flourishing. And has it always been the case that since you started paying attention to nature?
It's always been the case since
Yes.
Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species, and the social Darwinists had lassoed an idea and misrepresented it. I mean, essential to the idea of Darwinism is that change is for the better. I mean, I'm not sure I entirely buy into that. I think that change actually is more interesting than always being for the better. But in a basic way, I mean, if you think about storytelling itself, for example, storytelling itself fits very much into the Darwinian model. Because human beings have been publishing books for a few hundred years, but narrative has existed, one imagines, surely narrative has existed, ever since human beings had fire and conversation. It's flourished. Look at it, look at this great haul of published printed versions of narrative that is around us today. If by Darwinist theory, storytelling did not confer upon us as a species some kinds of advantage, it would have died out. And it hasn't died out. And whatever happens to the book, doesn't matter whatever form it is that we're encountering narrative in the future, whether it's in printed pages or whether it's on a screen or however it comes to us, we can be uncertain about the answer to that. But the one thing we can be absolutely certain about is that storytelling itself will survive while people can talk. And therefore, that's my optimism. And the pessimism that you refer to is the misrepresentation of Darwinism, in my view.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that always makes me optimistic about your work is simply how fantastically beautifully written it is. And I don't want to make that sound kind of aesthetic in a limited way. It is exhilarating. Every sentence is a delight. And I always wonder, how hard do you have to work to inhabit your prose so fully and so richly? Does it get any easier? Is it always a struggle with the rough marble of language?
See, when someone asks me that question, and I can hear that question coming, I start to listen to the question itself. And if you can play back the question in your mind, it was a beautifully modulated question. It had its falls, it has its rhythms, it has its proper amount of syllables, and Boyd is not gone to some special effort to polish his question. It's just that's the way that humankind talks. We have forgotten that because written prose tends to forget the poetry and the timpani and the percussion and the melody of the spoken language. We naturally have a skill to sound musical when we speak, and we lose that skill when we write it down. So I think written prose is the odd person out. Our natural default position is to use in our daily conversations language which is beautiful. And so the question you're asking, my answer is, it's not hard. We all do it when we're chatting to friends.
Yes.
We all do it when we're telling jokes. We all know how to use words and place them in the correct place. It's just other writers have forgotten to do the same.
Well, that leads us on to the question of the poetry not only of everyday speech, but of everyday life. And I know, Jim, you didn't want to be too specific, but it would be nice to talk a little about Harvest, because it's your most recent book. It's recently out in paperback. And it is this tremendously powerful and affecting portrait of the destruction of a way of life, the destruction of a rural community in the interests of, I think, the trio of terms that the landowner uses are profit, progress, and enterprise. And it could be set almost anywhere, but it seems to be set in an English village at some point during the great wave of enclosure and appropriation that killed off the idea of common land. But we never know precisely when, and we never know precisely where. Why was it necessary for you to leave those identities open?
Well, it's a habit I've built up, and it's my Puritanism, again, I'm afraid. When I was a journalist, I was very aware that I had to be completely honest, and I shouldn't make stuff up. I'd seen the damage that making stuff up had done, not only in journalism, but also in fiction. You think of the damage, for example, that The Heart of Darkness by Conrad is inflicted on Africa, so that you're hardly any article about Africa where things, in the rare examples in different African countries where things might be going wrong, you will always see that phrase, the heart of darkness, as an explanation of what that whole continent is about, as if blackness and savagery were somehow connected. And that's a gift of a very well-written novel, but a kind of a cruel novel, Conrad. So I was very conscious that first of all, as a journalist, I had to, if I was writing journalistic pieces, make sure that whatever I was describing, the place looked like that, smelt like that, and tasted like that. It had to be true. But also that I couldn't just plonk my inventions colonially on existing places. I couldn't set my first book continent in Africa, which I could very well have done, because then anything I made up about my characters would not be true to a real place. And I wasn't prepared to go along with that. So, by almost default, but a default that suited me, I realized that invented fiction rather than mirror fiction was what I wanted to be involved in. What I discovered very quickly was that writing like that, rather than being the kind of fiction which I admire, which locates you in a real place, it does the opposite. It dislocates you. And dislocation actually is kind of a much more fragmented variable weapon than location. Location is quite a narrow skill. But dislocation has all sorts of effects on the reader, because it dislocates you geographically, but it also dislocates you emotionally and psychologically. So that's been the template for my books subsequently. Now, when it came to Harvest, I realized that the occasion for Harvest was a particular place. It was me walking in the West Midlands in these fields where the ridge and furrow of the last ploughing in the 15th, 16th, 17th century is still in the field and still beautiful. I was struck, of course, immediately by the fact that this beauty, even though it was etched into the landscape, was actually a record of a dispossession. So if you're a writer, you like that idea. Dispossession and beauty together, it's too exciting not to follow. But why would I want to be writing a book about medieval or Tudor times when I want to be political? I realized that actually the story of dispossession of people from their land is going on everywhere in the world. And that as we sit here today, somewhere in Brazil, they are losing land to soya barons. In South India, I was there recently, I was told that entrepreneurs are buying up land they have no relationship with just because the increased price of food has made it worth their while to turf old farmers off their land. Anyway, we could go on forever, but somewhere in the world, every minute, someone is losing their lands for that reason. So if I set it too specifically in a place which was named and a date which was given, I would lose the contemporary relevance of that novel, and it was only the contemporary relevance that I was interested in.
That's interesting, because it is the opposite of a period novel. It's the opposite of an antique. It is utterly, utterly contemporary. Do you think it's about the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of expulsion and dispossession? Is there a danger that for you or any writer looking at this process of loss, that we can get a bit too nostalgic about the village world that is being swept away? I mean, I don't think Harvest is. It shows that it's a very tough and in some ways quite a limited way of life.
Well, nostalgia's fine until it gets in the way of progress. I mean, there's no reason why the two things can't coexist. There's the Jungian idea. I've never read a single word of, well, I've only ever read a sentence of Jung, and this is it. He says that the cost of anything new worth having is the loss of something old worth keeping, which is a brilliant concept, isn't it? Because what it suggests is that there are vacuums left behind by any act of progress, and that there are things to be regretted about the loss, but also things to be glorified about the loss, and that the new thing that we've got is something to be welcomed and to be feared. And I think that's sort of broadly true. I mean, it's a generalization, of course, but I think it's broadly true of the world. And because I believe it's broadly true of the world, you're going to find the same tug and pull and push in my novels.
Yes, yeah.
But can I just say one other thing? There's storytelling, weirdly, traditional storytelling tends to take the old way. It tends to favour the old ways of humankind over the new. Yeah. And if you look at folk tales, for example, it's never the young man or the young woman who is the person to be glorified. It's always the wise old woman or the wise old man. Yeah. And there's this idea that wisdom belongs to the past and foolhardiness belongs to the future. So I think that I found it hard in my novels to resist that inherited narrative habit.
And I'm afraid I have to ask you this because we mentioned it before and it has been discussed recently. At one point you hinted that you were going to give up fiction.
Yeah.
I very much hope that's not the case. Can you reassure us?
It's none of your business.
Yes, yes.
But foolishly, I made the mistake. I was writing a novel which failed. We had some very serious illness in my family. I also was 65 years old. This was 3 years ago, 65 years old, and thought, I'm fit and well. There's loads of things I want to do, and it's not healthy sitting by yourself with no colleagues in front of a blank screen. I was also aware, and all these arguments still hold firm with me, that a writing career cannot and should not last forever. If you're lucky enough to have written 11 novels, as I have done, then that's plenty. If people have read all of your 11 novels, they really should be reading somebody else. And if they haven't read all of them, go and buy them. So I felt that actually it would be sensible to move on. And I announced this, idiotically, not just privately to my wife, but to Mariella Frostrup on that BBC radio thing. And of course, ever since then, no one gave a damn whether I ever wrote another book up until that point. But then it became an issue. And I've been plagued by it. Thank you so much, Boyd. But I was foolish, actually, of course, as I should have known I would have been. I do want to give up writing. I would love to be free to just look after my garden, do more politics, walk more, do those things. But I keep on being nagged by ideas of novels. And I'm being severely nagged by an idea of a novel at the moment. I've even got a title for it, and I've even got some opening paragraphs. So I regret to inform you there will be a 12th book.
Thank you very much. That's the best news we could possibly have today. I would like to ask something about, it seems slightly odd, about numbers in your book. There's often a very, very strong sense of patterning. If you look at The Devil's Larder, if you look at Quarantine, which is about 40 days in the wilderness, if you look at Six, which is about the different liaisons of an actor. Do you find it useful to have that sense of structure, of pattern? Because it seems to be very subtly deployed, but also recurrent in your book.
I'll tell you what it is. If you're a genre writer, you need to plan things beforehand. If you're a detective fiction writer, you need to know where characters are. You need to have the dagger in the library at the right time. But that's no fun for me. What I like to do is to fly by the seat of my pants. To have have an empty canvas before I start, have a vague idea of what I want the book to do, but to have no characters, to have no plot, to have no setting, to let it evolve under its own steam. In other words, to abandon myself to whatever narrative will offer me in its generosity and in its wisdom. But of course, that's quite scary. And so in order to make sense of that abandonment, I tend to seize on anything which will give me something schematic to work in my favor. And so, my books, I think, can be over-schematic. And they do cling to numbers and they do cling to tight patterns. But that's only because I'm slightly nervous of the great sprawling uncertainties that are next day's work.
Thank you. Well, our time is more or less up. As I said, Jim has very kindly agreed to sign copies at Foyles down the road. The most important number we have to bear in mind is that there will now be a dozen Jim Crace novels, which is the best news to emerge from the London Book Fair. So thank you, Jim, very much for coming today.
Thank you, Boyd. That's very kind.